Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please subscribe and share so you will never miss an episode. Android users can find us and subscribe on your Play Music app. Apple users can find us and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. You can find us on Stitcher. You can follow us on Spreaker. And you can find the podcasts on jimmyhinton.org or findingahealingplace.com. Please rate our show, subscribe, and share so that we can spread the word. Let's get into the show. Well, welcome to this week's podcast. We have with us a very special guest, but first we'll introduce myself, Jimmy Hinton here.
And Jimmy's mom, Clara.
And with us we have Mary DeMuth, a personal friend of mine, and I'm just excited to have Mary today. Mary, welcome.
Thank you so much. It's such a privilege. I am a huge fan of this podcast, and I promote it as much as I possibly can. So I feel kind of humbled and scared to be on your podcast. You guys are famous to me.
Awesome. Well, no reason to be scared, except for Mom. She can be a little intimidating.
Mary, you know better.
But we're absolutely thrilled to have you, and I feel the same way about you. You just are one of my heroes, and I just appreciate everything you do. Mary is an acclaimed author. She's got 35. How many books does this make now?
This will be 36.
This will be number 36. So that's very exciting. And Mary just has written some fantastic books. And I believe my first introduction into your work, Mary, was with Not Marked, which is still one of my all-time favorite books. It's just absolutely fantastic. And I just commend you. I think what you do and what you write is just superb. And Mary is herself an abuse survivor. And God bless you because you speak very openly about it. And I just think you have so much wisdom in this area. So thank you for being with us again.
It's absolutely my pleasure, and want to commend you as well for sharing your difficult story, both of your difficult stories. And right before we started recording this, I said that I got an email, and this is just part of the spiritual warfare that happens when we share our stories. And I just want to encourage the listeners today that they may get emails like this when they share their stories, especially in the public realm. This person writes to me, if you've been healed and delivered and your past issues dealt with, why do you keep talking about the abuse over and over again? How does it help you? In case of a testimony, it's okay, but I don't see how it's helpful to keep highlighting and mentioning it vividly, the way it's put. My father sexually groomed me. I've read that so many times from you in your mail post. No one wants to dwell on the past, but such writings simply keep delving into it over and over again. Somehow it feels like going back to the cage. The Bible encourages us to dwell on the former things. While past experiences can serve as lessons, it doesn't serve as a guide. Victorious living is looking unto God for guidance and wisdom for every aspect of our lives. I find this disturbing. The words highlighted in bold and the way it's constructed. Sorry, these are my thoughts that came out of my head, from the top of my head. With due respect, signed somebody's name.
In Christian love. Well, I hear this so much, and it can be incredibly discouraging. And to me, this reeks of one of the common cliches that we hear out there. Why don't you just forgive, forget, and move on? I mean, essentially, that's what this email is saying. And I think it's such toxic theology. And this is how abusers get a free pass in our churches. It's this notion that if you're a survivor, if you've been oppressed, if you've been victimized in some manner, gee, that's bad, but man, you're just dragging us down. And so why don't you forget about it, quit talking about it, and stop bothering us with your problems. And the reality is that the Bible is crystal clear about speaking up and speaking out about oppression and abuse. And certainly Jesus did it throughout his entire ministry. He was constantly calling out abusers and oppressors. And I don't think he was overly popular in the preaching circles because he wasn't just this upbeat, positive, butterflies and roses kind of speaker. Jesus spoke truth into the lives of people. And I think that's why the oppressed really flocked to him. So I'm going to counter that email, Mary, just by
Thank you.
speaking up. And you're just bringing so much help and hope to thousands and thousands of survivors. So keep it up.
Mary, there is a genuine benefit to telling your story. And I think a lot of people don't get it if they don't have a similar story.
Yeah.
It's like, we don't want to hear this. I deal with child loss daily with parents who are grieving the loss of a child. That's their number one complaint. They've lost friends and family members over that because they keep bringing up the sadness. So I think it's a common thread when we have an issue that is heavy, so to speak, and when that is part of our story. And I think in this, as we get talking more, you'll bring out in a very real way why it's important for us to retell our story. So, yeah.
Well, I want to talk about your book because the release date is actually today. Well, we're pre-recording, so I hate to burst your bubble, people, but we're not live right now. The preacher in me is coming out. I'm just too honest. But all joking aside, the book is called The 7 Deadly Friendships: How to Heal When Painful Relationships Eat Away at Your Joy. And so today, October 1st, is the publication date, and from what I understand, tomorrow is the release date.
Yes, exactly.
Is that right?
Yep.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about what led you to write this book, The 7 Deadly Friendships.
Well, it actually does go back to my story. I was raised in a home with a narcissistic parent and a predatory parent. And so I didn't know that I was doing this, but after I met Christ and after, some healing even and all of that, I continued to pursue friendships and relationships that were not good for me. And why I did that was that I was trying to complete a story. So my story I was trying to complete was, if only I could get a narcissistic person to love me, I could prove I am worth being loved. If only I could get a predator to love me, I could prove that I am worth being loved. And this was subconsciously, had no idea I was doing this. But this incomplete story of not being loved back then drove me to try to complete it with other people. And then I would attract these people who are predatory or narcissistic. And it was only until I got to the point where I finally allowed Jesus to complete that story in me that I began to have more understanding about what I was doing. And so 2 of the deadly friendships of the 7 are, one of them is called Narcissist Nolan and one of them is called Predator Paige. And my apologies to anyone in the audience named Nolan or Paige. I didn't mean that.
Those names are now tainted forever.
Yes, poor Narcissist Nolan.
Yeah. That's, I think that's really important. And, one of the things that I'm really excited about with this book is, if I understand, and I'll let you speak more to this because you wrote the book, but it's really to help people identify when you're in an unhealthy relationship. And, I think for you as somebody who was married to a child sexual predator, and me as the son of a child sexual predator, we really didn't know it. We didn't have a clue. And I think therein lies the problem with identifying predators and how abusers just blend in so well. I mean, they are just incredibly good at blending in. And I think part of that is because they're not people who are detached from our emotions. They are our friends. They're our parents. They're our boyfriends, girlfriends, husbands, wives. And so I think I think that's what I'm really excited about with this book is, how do you really get in front of this and realize and recognize when you're in a relationship with somebody, when that becomes toxic.
And I wish I had this book when I was in my 20s. It would have saved me from so much heartache because I didn't realize that I was doing it. And there was no lists out there. And this was, before the internet and everything, but, there were no lists of like, this is what a predatory person is like. Cause I just kept thinking it was like the creepy guy in the white van, and that's not it. And, this is what someone with narcissistic personality disorder will do to you and make you crazy. This is their tactic. And this is what an unreliable friend looks like, a fair weather friend, or this is what a dramatic person who always has to have drama all around them, what they look like. And so I just have really, really simple checklists throughout the book of every chapter just walks you through traits of these people and helps you to kind of discover for yourself if you're in a relationship with someone like this.
So what are the 7 deadly friendships?
Yeah, so they are based on Proverbs 6, which are the 7 deadly sins. And there's other lists of 7 deadly sins throughout history, but this is the Proverbs one. And these are, as I mentioned, Narcissus Noland, Unreliable Uma, Predator Paige, Conman Connor, Tempter Trevor, Faker Fiona, and Dramatic Drake. And so these are folks that kind of circle in and around our lives. And I also don't make the mistake, which it would be a mistake. I don't make the mistake of saying that these are all these bad people that live outside of myself. Like they're all evil and I'm awesome. I don't want to make myself the center of this story or the hero, because I am sometimes some of those people. And so the book also helps you to understand when you're not being a good friend to somebody else, or you're not being in that, having that good relationship with someone else.
I think that's really important too, because that's one of the things that I can't remember which friend told me this, so I would love to give credit where credit is due. But one of my friends said, any one of us is capable of heading down a path and becoming the very person who we hate. Mm-hmm. And there's so much truth in that, because I think a lot of times we look at the abusers as these awful, horrible people, and they are. I mean, I'm not minimizing that. They really are horrible people who do horrible things. But the reality is that they weren't always these horrible people. From the time of infancy, they weren't these horrible people. Something or some things along the way caused them to start making really poor decisions and eventually turn into a very manipulative, controlling person. And so I think this is so important for so many reasons. But I think we have to have a self-awareness when we slip in and out of those modes, and we become maybe not an oppressor, but somebody who's abusive in some manner, whether it's with our words or with our attitudes or whatever it is. I think that's really, really important.
And my husband has said this, and I really do believe it. I think self-awareness is one of the hallmarks of growth in a Christian's life. And if you don't have it, you're not going to grow. And if you look at a lot of predatory people, they're very delusional about what they think about themselves, and they tend to be fairly prideful, but they don't look at themselves. They don't take into consideration that their actions are harming others. And that is a lack of self-awareness. And of course, right. A lot of other things mixed in that stew, but that's one of them.
Yeah, sure. So how does this apply to our family? So in the family structure, how do we apply these principles? Because this question is kind of, I guess, personal to me, because there are times when my wife, who is very blunt, she's an introvert, I'm an extrovert. So she is a woman of very few words. And she just tells me that's because she just has to make all of her words count. So she's very blunt, and she's kind of my anchor who pulls me back to reality. And sometimes that's a very painful process, because if I'm being an idiot, she's just going to tell me in very few words, Jimmy, you're being an idiot. And then she'll point out why. And she's absolutely right. And I love that I have that relationship where she's able to be that honest with me and to be that blunt with me. And, I think those really close family interpersonal relationships are really important for people to be honest within the family structure. So explain a little bit about that.
Yeah. So at the end of the book, I look at two people who have encountered all 7 deadly friendships. One, of course, is Jesus, because we have to have him in a book and he always has the answer to everything. The other, though, is Joseph, and his deadly friendships were actually most of them were in his family, and he encountered some pretty awful things. And so I look at his life and how he dealt with that. One of the things that I think is important, and what your wife has actually given you as a gift, is we need each other to discern our relationship. So for instance, I had an experience where I was in a relationship with kind of a combination of a narcissist Nolan and a tempter Trevor. But I was too enmeshed in it. I couldn't see it. And so I had to ask other friends who weren't connected to this one, am I going crazy? And please give me some feedback on whether this is right or wrong, or is my perception skewed? And so the end of that, the long answer to your question is that we need each other. I can't always discern correctly my relationships. I need people on the outside who are willing to speak the truth in love, like your wife. And those people are actually really great allies in our with our discernment muscle, because sometimes we just can't see it.
Yeah. Yeah. I was telling Mom over the last couple of weeks, I have that relationship. I have a really bizarre relationship with my elders at church. So I think there are always these relationships between preachers and elders, and whatever, that there's this tension. It's like the dirty little secret in the room, but nobody wants to admit it. They don't want to publicly say that they have relationship struggles with the other leaders. So they all walk out and everything's great and it's fantastic and we all get along and we whistle. At our congregation, we let our church know that there are times when we fight like cats and dogs. But the cool part about that is my 2 elders have also been my anchor, and they do things like, if they see me taking up one of these characteristics, they'll pull me aside and they'll say, "Hey, we noticed this about you." In fact, they just did it a few weeks ago. And I mean, they really stepped on my toes. And one of my elders asked me a question. He said, "You may not realize it." And I didn't. He was absolutely right. But he said, there are people within the congregation who have made comments and they're asking what's up with you. So we're asking you, what's up with you? And of course I was like, nothing. What are you talking about? Like, I was actually offended that they were asking me that question. And then he asked this question. He said, one of my elders said, "Are you okay right now?" And that question absolutely stunned me. Like it just, like, it snapped me out of the false world that I was living in. And I had this really long pause, and he said, "Is that a hard question?" And I said, kind of, because I don't know the answer to that. And just that simple question opened up this flood of emotions. And for the next week, like, there was one night where I literally cried myself to sleep. And I didn't know why. Like, I had no idea. And I think I was just releasing all of this tension that had been built up in me. But, one of the really cool things was, after he asked me that question, "How are you doing?" he said, "By the way, we're going to be asking your wife that same question. Because you may say that you're doing okay, or that you're handling life well, or whatever, but your wife is going to know much better than you how you're doing." And I thought that was really cool. Like, there's a lot of wisdom in that.
They are fantastic elders to be able to do that. They're very wise. It takes a certain person to be able to question like that, and question your inner self. We can have somebody do that, and we take great offense because it's done not in the right manner. which, we've probably all experienced from time to time. But what you're talking about is wonderful.
Yeah, and I think, speaking to the self-awareness that you're talking about, Mary, I think, we have to be willing to have that self-awareness. And that means that when people tell us things about ourselves that we don't like, that we may not see. In my case, I didn't see it. Mm-hmm. And when they said it, at first, I have to admit, I was really defensive. And they picked up on that. And so I started defending myself. But then I had the self-knowledge to know once you start defending yourself to that degree, there's some amount of guilt. Somewhere in there, there's some amount of guilt. And so it just, it caused me to pause and stop and say, why am I so defensive? Like why am I so emphatic that I have to defend myself right now? And I think self-awareness it's really tough, but we have to be open to it, and we have to be willing to be offended and not take it personally.
Yeah, I agree. And I think, really what our lives are, if we really want to boil it down, our lives are our relationships. It's, those people in our lives our families, our friends. And so that's my hope, is just to empower people to be better choosers when they're choosing their friends, and then also to be a better friend to other people, to have those moments, to be willing to speak the truth in love to others. And again, there has to be relational capital there. Some stranger couldn't come up to you and say, "What's with you?" You'd just be like, "Okay, whatever, I'm dismissing you." But yeah, we have to have those conversations, and they're so important. And I look back on my own growth, and almost always they revolve around some sort of difficult conversation.
Yeah, I agree. Well, what deadly friend do you most identify with out of the 7?
And I admit this in the book, I can tend toward the dramatic. And so I'm a dramatic Drake at times. And there are times as well where I bend over or lean into narcissism and be self-centered. And so I have really worked hard on those traits in me. One time a good friend said, "Mary, you are reactionary." And then I reacted to him like, "No, I'm not." So just proved his point. And so I've really took that to heart, and learning how first of all, that the world doesn't revolve around me. I don't have the perfect perspective on everything. Of course, I don't have the most correct theology, because nobody does. And the life is consistent with me surrendering and serving others, not with me being a me monster.
I think that's really important. And I think one of the challenges with that, at least for myself, this is not to talk about me, because I don't want to be a narcissistic Nelly or whoever, poor Nolan out there. I have a brother-in-law named Noel, so that's pretty similar. So I'm going to call him that from now on, narcissistic Noel.
You could be jovial Jimmy.
I like that. I knew there was a reason we were friends, Mary.
Clarifying Clara.
There you go.
But you had talked about serving others, and part of being a disciple of Jesus. I mean, in fact, a big part is Jesus says, if you want to be my disciple, you need to deny yourself, take up your cross daily, and follow me. And part of that denying ourselves means that we do serve other people, and that we do it willingly, that we do it happily, and that we don't do it out of a sense of obligation, but we do it because we genuinely love those people. And in fact, I just had this conversation this morning with my elders, and I said, I found myself at church on Sunday getting irritated inside at some of the people within our congregation, just because there were so many needs that were coming at me all at once. Like the second I walked over the threshold into the church building, I kind of got bombarded with different needs. And I said, and I don't want to be that person. Like, I don't want to be the person who serves, but gets irritated or serves people. And because I'm tired, I walk away, and I begrudge the people who I served. And so, I think throughout this process, one of the things that I think limits our self-knowledge is exhaustion. Mm-hmm. And we need to realize that Sabbath is really important. And just taking time away from people to separate ourselves when we feel irritated, when we feel annoyed, to separate ourselves and to just find meditation.
Well, and I think that's true about choosing, the relationships that we're in, is if we're on the edge and if we're totally stressed out, our guard is down and we're not thinking like very clearly about what we want or what it makes a good friend or, whatever. And so I think there's a lot of problems that could be solved by a day of rest every week. I absolutely agree with you.
Yeah. Yeah. I had said on Sunday, I said, if we just stop and just listen, just kind of passively listen to the world, there's so much noise at any given time. Like, we don't separate ourselves from that noise. And like, sometimes I find myself where I just take these deep breaths and I don't even it's like I'm gasping for air. Like I've gone, 45 seconds without breathing and I don't even realize it. And I think it's just all this stress from always just hearing that noise in the background. And it's true. I mean,
Jimmy, I'm just sitting quietly thinking.
I know, I can't believe it. This is the first.
I know, being a young mother, and I journaled for a while, and then I stopped journaling because my journal entries were all the same. I'm just so tired. So tired. We need replenishment. We need a breakaway. We need that time, like you said, taking that time to simply rest. It is so important to us. We see life, we see God, we see Jesus, we see each other in a totally different light when we are rested. I will amen that and amen that again and again.
Do you think, Mary, that can be an indicator of a good indicator of an unhealthy friendship? When you're chronically exhausted, you're just run down, anxious, tired, on edge.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I have learned to be a little more cautious about, or noticing more of, is if I've left somebody's presence and I feel more exhausted and more defeated and the lies in my head are more louder, I have to look and think, okay, wait a minute. This is not that we shouldn't be in relationship with people who are hard, because we do want to love all sorts of people, of course. But in our closest relationships, we're pretty much the sum of our very closest relationships. If they are draining us, then either the problem is something in the relationship or perhaps the other person. And it also could be what you've mentioned, just this exhaustion that seeps into everything. And I'd also say that it seeps into our social media and our inability to love people online. It happens so much. Like, we don't view the other person across the pixels as an image bearer of Christ, and we react quickly out of our exhaustion and our rightness or whatever, and we don't dignify the other person on the other end. We just shout at each other with megaphones, and we do not listen. And so if I could mention something besides Sabbath, which is amazing, number 2 would be to become absolute people that listen and ask great questions.
Yeah. Boy, that's really important. Yeah. Man, we could do a whole podcast just on that. Yeah, my wheels spinning, Mary.
Yeah.
Well, and that's what I do with abuse victims. And I'm sure you do the same. And I get emails all the time from people who are having, really hard stories. And when I meet with them face to face, that's what I do. I listen, I'm quiet. I pray sometimes or pray at the end, but I ask a lot of questions. I don't push, because you should never push someone to disclose something they don't want to disclose. But I think it's an act of love to really want to understand where someone is coming from. And I think that's why Jesus was so effective. He was always pursuing people no one wanted to pursue, and the outcasts, the outliers, the people on the edges of society. And, like the woman with the issue of blood, that was a really long time for her to be sick and an outcast. And he basically wanted to know her story, and she said it, and he healed her, and how amazing that whole interchange was.
It's funny you bring that up, because that's been one of the most intriguing stories of Jesus. And I've heard that taught and preached as if Jesus was kind of irritated, like, who touched me? But then they have no explanation for why Jesus was agitated. And so they just kind of mention it in passing and then they move on. And I'm like, I don't think for a second that Jesus was agitated with that woman. I think when he asked that question, and by the way, he knew full well who had touched him.
Right.
So it begs the question, why would he ask the woman publicly to say who she was, to identify herself? And, I look at this as an extreme act of compassion on Jesus' part. And I think it's the same thing. Like when Peter and John in Acts chapter 3 were going up the temple steps, and there's the lame beggar there. Peter says something to that man that a lot of people gloss over, but for me, it's such a riveting moment. Peter says, "Look at us." And the man looked up. And you have to ask the question, why did Peter say, "Look at us"? He could have just as easily said, "Hey, silver and gold we do not have, but what we do have, we give to you. In the name of Jesus, get up and walk." But Peter first says, "Look at us." And if you look at Luke's account, which Luke also records the woman with the issue of blood, Luke does these really cool things in there, but where he just kind of freezes time. But just prior to Peter and John's encounter with this man on the temple steps, Peter denies Jesus, and Luke records this. It's one of the coolest passages in the New Testament, I think. It says, "And Jesus turned and looked directly at Peter. And Peter went outside and he wept bitterly." And I look at this and I think, that look that Jesus had with Peter was just this impassioned look of forgiveness and understanding and grace. And I think Peter returned that look to the man on the temple steps. And I think with this woman with the issue of blood, Jesus calls her out not to embarrass her, but to demonstrate his absolute love and compassion for her, and to say, "Hey, I notice you." For the first time in 12 years, the woman was noticed. I think it's just so powerful.
Yeah, I think that's just one of the things we can do is just say, "I notice you."
Yeah. So, okay, tell us, you started off the podcast by reading an email that said, "Don't dig into the past. Don't mention it. You want to make us all barf." So explain why it's important to deal with your own broken past in order to move forward. Why talk about it?
Well, that was the means by which I healed. So I have told audiences before, I know you've heard me say this, Jimmy, but an untold story never heals. And after I met Christ, I began telling that story, and I encountered people who believed in prayer, and they prayed for me for 4 years that I would get healed. And I would not ever be naive enough to say that I'm 100% healed. I'm still on that journey. But if you keep it inside, it festers. And a lot of times what I find with abuse survivors is that if they don't talk about it, it still comes out, but in their actions. And it usually comes out in bewildering actions. Like, why did I do that? Why did I say that? Why did my parents, words come out of my mouth when I swore I would never be like that? Or why? And that's how it happens, is the story will come out. If it's not through your mouth, it's going to come out through your hands and your feet. And so better to let it out, to breathe in the light of day, because there's so much lies and shame that happen when you keep it internally. When you let it out, you give it space to breathe. Now, I on the other hand, I have to say that the email that I received today was also, there's a nugget of truth in there. We don't need to stay there. I am an abuse survivor, yes, but I'm not the same as I was when I was first dealing with this, a couple decades ago. There is victory, there is healing, there is progress, there is that. And the only reason that I bring it up now is not because I'm sad about it, not because I'm not healed, but because there are so many people out in the world, church too, me too, who just need to hear other people tell their stories, and they just need to know that they are not alone. And so I will do it, even though, it's the past, and God has done some great things and he continues to heal me. I'm not, like I said, not 100% there, but I share it not for my own sake. I'm not sharing it to get attention. I'm sharing it so someone else can say, oh gosh, I'm so glad I'm not the only one with that story.
Yeah.
Plus, I think, Mary, it's so important for people to see and to hear just what you said. I'm not the same person I was 20 years ago. Fast forward and, move forward and look who you are today. And, by telling your story, by sharing your story, by getting it out, the healing that has come along, I think that's critically important for people to see.
That there's hope, and that there's so what to your story? Like, I've morphed from a woman who has been injured to a woman who is being healed to a woman who is now wanting to release other people into healing. Right. So, you've been harmed, then you heal, then you become a healer. And of course, Jesus is always the healer, but I get to participate in part of that because of the length of time that I've gone through grief and lament and all the things that you have to mourn when you have been stolen from.
Sure. Right.
So how do you know, say that you're identifying these deadly relationships, and say that you identify 2 or 3 of them with somebody who you're close to. How do you discern, how do you know that critical point when it's time to step away? Because for me, that's one of the most challenging things. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why we have such a toxic culture within the majority of churches who have known abusers in the churches, and why they get so much protection from the leadership. I don't think it's because the leaders are like, man, isn't that great that, children and vulnerable adults are being abused? I don't think the leaders feel that way.
Yeah.
I think that there's a part of them, a big part of them, that when they're face to face with the abuser, that all these walls just start coming down. And in my experience consulting with churches, 100% of the time, or maybe close to 100, maybe 100, maybe it's not quite 100, but it's in the 90s, 95% of the time. When I lay all the facts on the table, they're like, rah, 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 this is so horrible. And this person, we're going to confront them. My message to them is always be careful, because when you're face to face with them, they're going to be working you. They're going to be nice. They're going to be kind. They're going to be crying. They're going to talk about all the good that they've done in the church, and your walls are going to come down. And inevitably 95+% of the time, that's exactly what happens. So when you're in a relationship with somebody, how do you know it's the critical point when it's now time to step away, whether that's permanently or temporarily? How do you know when it's the right time?
That's a great question. And I would say in these 7 friendships, there are just a couple that I would advocate walking away from. And those would be those predatory ones and those narcissistic ones. And so awareness is the first step. And again, it's a degree. Like, there's no formula here. Like, we can't just say 100% of the time you do this and 100% of the time you don't do that. But this is where I get back to having other friends in your life, and other relationships, family members who love you, who have walked you through over the long haul. That's how I was able to see what was going on, was other people who loved me and who had my best interest at heart were able to say, that is not a good relationship for you, and this is why. And it empowered me to be able to do those really hard things, because let me just tell you, if you want to break up with a predator or a narcissist, it's not going to be easy. And there will be, there could be on one hand what you would describe, where there's, oh, I'm so sorry, and the repentance, but there also could be the other side, which is what I've experienced, is this angry backlash of venom. And it isn't very much fun to go through, because then you become the graceless person who walked away from somebody in need, or however you want to say that. And none of us want to be the graceless person who believes, that someone can't change. And I don't believe that people can't change. I believe that they can, but I believe I can't change them. And only they can, under the guise of the power of the Holy Spirit and a willingness and surrender on their part. I've had reconciliation with friendships that have gone south, and it has been amazing and beautiful. But most of the ones that involved narcissistic people or predatory people, they have been irrevocably broken. And maybe on the other side, on heaven's shores, we'll get to have a hug and it'll be great. But on this side of heaven, they're messy and they're hard. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I will say having other good community around you will help you with that.
There was a Bible story that came to mind just as you were talking, and I thought about Paul and Barnabas.
Right.
That's a really important story, and a lot of people gloss over that one too. But Barnabas, were it not for Barnabas, which means son of encouragement, Paul would have never been into ministry. Like, Barnabas was the guy who vouched for Paul when everybody was like, no, that guy kills Christians. We can't be anywhere near him. Like, this guy's, we don't trust him. Paul's just doing this. He has an ulterior motive. He's going to put us in prison. Barnabas was the one who put his neck on the line, and he vouched for Paul. They go through their first missionary journey together, which was incredible. Absolutely just earth-shattering. At the end of that, Paul and Barnabas have such a strong disagreement that they part companies, and they never do ministry again for the rest of Paul or Barnabas's life. And I look at that and I'm like, man, Paul, I think in a lot of ways, Paul was just really hard to get along with. I do. I think where Barnabas was super full of grace, Paul was just like, nope, this is how it is. And, not that was a bad thing, but it was just Paul's personality. But the incredible thing to me is that both Paul and Barnabas had the wisdom to realize that by trying to reconcile prematurely, that would have done damage to the gospel, to the church, to other people's relationships. They had the wisdom to say, hey, we can part company. Maybe we can't reconcile it at this moment, but it's best if we just part company and we still do our thing in the Lord. And I think that's really important for us to understand as Christians, because I see so many churches that try to force people to reconcile. And so you have a woman who's being beat by her husband, or you have a child who's been raped by a predator. And the church is like, man, you got to forgive and you got to reconcile, and it's reconciliation or hell, And I'm like, no, like, reconciliation sometimes is absolutely dangerous, even if you've gotten to a point where you can forgive each other.
Yeah. And there's, all sorts of books written about this in terms of boundaries and safe people and all of that there's been times where I've had to enact very severe boundaries around myself with difficult people. And it's actually proven to be a really good thing for both of us, weirdly. Mm-hmm. And, that also with Paul and Barnabas, you have to bring in the John Mark part of that. Their disagreement was about John Mark. And eventually at the end, Paul and John Mark, who had a great disagreement, they did reconcile in a way, like he mentions him as good for service. And so, there's precedent for both. There's precedent for reconciliation. There's precedent for not, because as Romans 12 says, as far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men, but you can only control your side of the story. And if the other person is a predatory person who has harmed you and does not acknowledge their sin, then that's only half of the reconciliation available to make it work. And if they don't, then it's a forced reconciliation to say, well, I know that they're gritting their teeth and saying, I'm sorry you feel that way, so therefore you must reconcile with them. That is not, I don't think Jesus wants us to do that either, because that's false. And that would be enabling or empowering or, enabling someone else's sin by saying everything's fine. Right. He said he's sort of sorry, so it's all good. Isn't the cause of Christ not damaged? But then meanwhile, that guy goes out or girl goes out and keeps perpetrating and ruining the cause of Christ one person at a time.
Yeah, I completely agree. You're quiet over here. Do you agree?
I am quiet.
Do you agree with Mary?
I am thinking how difficult it is, Mary, when you are in a marriage. And I'll be very personal. In my own marriage, I was the one who did not want to stay with my husband. It was prior to knowing that he was, harming children. I had no idea. But the narcissistic behavior, which was invisible to all those around me, was killing me. And I'll use that word. I felt like I would die if I had to stay with him for another 6 months. I prayed and prayed and prayed and prayed about this. When that relationship began falling apart, I began losing everybody around me because the predator and the narcissism in him was so great that I was seen as the person who was the bad guy by family members, by my church family, by neighbors in my neighborhood. It was horrible. So when you're saying it's not easy to withdraw, and it's not easy when you set boundaries for yourself, it's not easy. It's horrific. And I'm still feeling the after effects this many years later, because I get the looks, and I still will get people asking me, I don't know why you didn't try to tough it out a little longer. No, I do. I do yet. And scripturally, there are many people who do not consider my separating and then finally divorce from John as any kind of scriptural divorce at all. It is me. I've been told, you do know this was you who ended this marriage. And it's really, really difficult. It really is painfully difficult. Yeah. I mean, and I don't know, I'm bearing scars of it, and I live daily with it. Yeah. So what you're talking about, and your spouse should be your best friend of all. We're talking about friend relationships, but these relationships within the family are tough. When you're dealing with that, very, very tough. So I'm kind of quiet because I'm feeling, I really am. I'm shaking inside yet. And I probably will. I'm on the path to healing, but it's a journey. It's a long journey yet from this.
Well, I would say that, just thinking about your story, that you perceived his adultery, even though it was toward younger children, you perceived it in your soul. And you have biblical grounds in that sense because of
sadly
what he was doing.
Not. Where I'm coming from with that that's a whole nother thing, but people can be so outwardly different than they are, and they don't know what goes on in the confines of a relationship. And sometimes when you try to tell your story, as I did several times, it was like, this cannot be what's going on, and
they just don't want to believe it.
I don't want to believe it. And shame on you for talking about our minister and our good friend. And so it's difficult, painfully difficult to make this separation. And I'm sure there are, many, many people listening who identify with that. And I think that's another reason why your book is going to be so great for us. I can't wait to get my hands on one, to tell you the truth. I cannot wait. So I will be a critiquer of your book. How's that?
That's awesome.
Okay.
Yeah, I feel like that's the story you just shared is the reason I wrote that book. Because I think there's a lot of us who are in crazy making relationships, whether they be marriages or in families or with a friend or whatever. And we're like, there's something wrong. Yeah. I don't have the words to articulate it, But here's a book that has the list. Here's the traits. And that's what I'm hoping to help people that way.
That is going to be such a blessing to so many. Yes.
Well, and I'll put another plug in for you, Mary, because
I did not ask Jimmy to do this, by the way.
No, she didn't.
No.
There was no money involved.
I'm an author. I don't have any money.
That's right. But Mary's writing style is, man, your style is just so relatable.
Yeah.
And I've admittedly not read 35 of your 36 books. But I got to tell you, like, you know, when I read Not Marked, I couldn't put it down, and it was so readable and so relatable and so conversational, and you know that really is more of a gift than a style. And I think people need to realize, like, you know, when you're talking about relationships, you talk about checklists, but I don't want people to hear that, you know, it's just like this, you know, down through the checklist. Like, Mary's writing style is incredibly just engaging and relatable. And I'm really excited for this. I think it's so important. So important. So thank you.
Thank you. That's my heart. And I really, you know, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer. There's another, that she's not one of the 7 deadly friends, but I don't want to be her because the end of the book is hope. It's looking at Jesus. It's looking at Joseph. It's looking at principles that will help you get through with joy, that you don't have to be, you don't have to have these really hard relationships define you for the rest of your life. And nor do those lies that are spoken over you, whether implied or spoken out loud, do they need to be the definition of who you are. And especially for abuse victims, that's a huge problem for a lot of us. We internalize those lies. We think about ourselves in terms of why we were preyed on. And so this book is one of my gifts back to help you realize that you are worth being loved. And really, that's the story I started with. Is, you know, I was trying to complete the story with the wrong kind of people. And I've learned a lot through making 1 million mistakes. And this is hopefully something to help you make less than 1 million mistakes.
Yeah. Well, we always leave our listeners with a truth bomb at the end. I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you to come up with a truth bomb. But if in a nutshell, you could give us, what's the one big takeaway that you want people to get, just your heart and your passion that you want your readers to really get from this book, what would that be?
It's Jesus. It only can be Jesus. And I wouldn't be standing here today in this interview if it weren't for him and his amazing, you know, I may have been hurt by the church. I may have been hurt by the email I received today. I may have been hurt by people's judgment, but Jesus has been with me this whole time, and he has listened and dignified him and healed. And it always has to go back to him. He is the answer to, at least for me, he's been the answer to all that struggle.
Awesome. Well, Mary, thank you again for being with us. I'm just so glad and honored to have you as a guest today, and I'm sure you are as well.
Mary, it's just been wonderful even to have this conversation with you. I can't wait to get my hands on your book. I cannot wait to read it, to digest it, and to read it again and again, and to use that as a gift of healing. Thank you ever so much. Thank you.
And I will, Mary, put a link to your book, 7 Deadly Friendships, in the description of this episode. And again, thank you. And we want to thank our listeners for joining this episode of our podcast, and we'll catch you next round. Thanks again for listening to today's episode of the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast. If you found it helpful, please follow on Spreaker, subscribe on Google Play Music, Apple Podcasts, or Stitcher. Share with your friends and tell the world. Join us in speaking out on sex abuse so we can change the tides and prevent abuse.